Washington D.C. appears to be just another bustling American city, but beneath its marble monuments and political theatre lies a story of ambition, compromise, and raw power that shaped a nation. Tonight, we'll uncover how a swampy stretch of land along the Potomac River transformed into the most influential square miles on Earth. This is the story of how America's founders literally built power into the landscape itself, creating a capital that would become the beating heart of democracy and the center of global influence for centuries to come. We'll start with a shocking revelation about the city's original purpose, and from there, we'll trace the relentless political maneuvering that brought this capital into existence. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the calculated history of Washington, D.C. When you think of Washington, D.C., perhaps you picture the gleaming dome of the Capitol building, tourists streaming past the Washington Monument, or protesters gathering on the National Mall. This city feels like the very embodiment of American power, and indeed it was designed to be exactly that. As the seat of federal government and home to the President, Congress, and Supreme Court, there's an undeniable sense that this place has witnessed every major decision that shaped our nation. You can imagine that these streets have seen it all, every triumph and scandal that defined American politics over the centuries. Relatively speaking, most of the iconic architecture in Washington isn't actually that old. The Lincoln Memorial was built in the 20th century, as were many of the grand federal buildings that line the city's wide boulevards. But the area now known as Washington, D.C. has been significant to American power since the very founding of the Republic. And it's also the site of a hidden story that most Americans never learn. In the 1790s, during the earliest negotiations about where to place the nation's capital, some extraordinary political deals were struck. Constitutional compromises, backroom negotiations, and dinner party agreements that would determine not just where Americans would govern themselves, but how they would govern themselves. It's remarkable to imagine that here, where lobbyists stride through marble halls today, the entire structure of American federalism was hammered out over wine and conversation. However, the true story of Washington, D.C. has to begin with the area's earliest inhabitants and the land itself. Humans first settled along the Potomac River thousands of years before any European ever glimpsed these shores, perhaps as early as 4,000 years ago. It seems likely that Native American communities were thriving in the Washington area for millennia, building sophisticated societies along these fertile riverbanks. There's abundant evidence of their presence, from archaeological sites to the very names that survive today. The Potomac River itself takes its name from the Potawatomi tribe, and many other local place names echo the indigenous peoples who first called this region home. During what Europeans would later call the colonial period, around 1600 to 1750, various tribes including the Nacotchtank, Piscataway, and Anacostan peoples lived throughout the area in established villages and seasonal camps. These communities had developed extensive trade networks, sophisticated agriculture, and complex political relationships with neighbouring tribes. They cultivated corn, beans, and squash along the river terraces, and their settlements would have been bustling centres of activity during certain seasons. The location that would become Washington, D.C. was strategically important even then, sitting at the convergence of major waterways and trade routes. By the early 18th century, European colonists were increasingly encroaching on these lands. Tobacco plantations began spreading throughout Maryland and Virginia, fundamentally altering the landscape and displacing indigenous communities. The area that would become Washington, D.C. was transformed into a patchwork of plantations, small farms, and scattered settlements. Towns like Georgetown in Maryland and Alexandria in Virginia emerged as important tobacco ports, shipping the valuable crop to markets in Europe. The land itself was mostly rolling hills covered in hardwood forests, with marshy areas along the Potomac and its tributaries. Much of what would become central Washington was quite swampy, particularly the areas that are now the National Mall and the neighborhoods south of the Capitol. This wasn't exactly prime real estate by the standards of the time, which makes the eventual selection of this location all the more intriguing. During the mid-18th century, this region was simply part of the broader Chesapeake tobacco economy. Enslaved African Americans provided the labor that made these plantations profitable, and their presence would profoundly shape the character of the future capital. The wealth generated by this forced labor system would later help finance some of the early construction in Washington, D.C. A dark irony that haunts the city's founding story. The area was rural, sparsely populated, and economically dependent on a single crop. To put this into perspective, in 1790, Georgetown had only about 3,000 residents, while Alexandria claimed roughly 2,700. The combined population of what would become the District of Columbia was probably no more than 8,000 people, most of them living on scattered farms and plantations. Then came the American Revolution, and everything changed. The 13 colonies' successful rebellion against British rule created an immediate problem that nobody had fully anticipated. Where would this new nation govern itself? Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had been essentially nomadic, meeting in different cities as circumstances demanded. They had convened in Philadelphia, New York, Annapolis, Trenton, and other locations, often fleeing when faced with unpaid soldiers or political pressures. This instability was more than just inconvenient. It was a fundamental weakness that threatened the new republic's credibility, both domestically and internationally. Foreign ambassadors never knew where to find the American government, and the lack of a permanent seat of power suggested a nation that couldn't even manage its own basic affairs. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 had created a stronger federal government, but it had deliberately avoided the thorny question of where that government should be located. The issue was left for the new Congress to resolve, and it quickly became one of the most contentious political battles of the early republic. The debate over the national capital was never really about finding the most convenient location. It was about power, influence, and the fundamental character of the new nation. Would the capital be in the north, reinforcing the commercial and financial interests centered in cities like New York and Philadelphia? Or would it be in the south, acknowledging the agricultural wealth and political influence of states like Virginia and South Carolina? Each region understood that hosting the national capital would bring enormous advantages. The capital would attract wealthy residents, stimulate commerce, and provide countless opportunities for political influence. More importantly, the capital's location would send a signal about which section of the country truly controlled the federal government. Northern states favored locations like New York City or Philadelphia, cities that were already major centers of commerce and culture. These locations had the infrastructure to support a national government and the sophistication that would impress foreign visitors. Southern states, however, feared that a northern capital would give too much influence to mercantile interests and undermine the agricultural economy that dominated their region. The deadlock seemed insurmountable. Congress spent months debating various proposals, with sectional tensions growing more heated with each passing week. Some representatives threatened to walk out entirely if their region's interests were ignored. The young nation appeared to be fracturing before it had even fully established itself. Into this crisis stepped three of the most brilliant political minds in American history: Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison would craft a solution so elegant and far-reaching that it would reshape not just the question of the capital, but the entire financial foundation of the new republic. The story of their famous dinner party compromise has become legendary in American political lore. though the details remain somewhat mysterious. Sometime in June 1790, Jefferson invited Hamilton and Madison to dine at his residence in New York. Over the course of the evening, they hammered out a deal that would break the congressional deadlock and establish the framework for America's financial system. Hamilton desperately needed congressional approval for his plan to have the federal government assume the Revolutionary War debts of individual states. This assumption plan was crucial to establishing the new nation's credit, but it faced fierce opposition from southern states that had already paid most of their war debts. They saw no reason to help pay the debts of northern states that had been less fiscally responsible. Jefferson and Madison, both Virginians, agreed to provide the southern votes Hamilton needed for debt assumption. In exchange, Hamilton would use his influence to ensure that the permanent national capital would be located in the South, specifically in a new federal district to be carved out of Maryland and Virginia along the Potomac River. This wasn't just a simple trade of votes, it was a carefully calculated political strategy that would balance sectional interests for decades to come. The South would get the capital, providing them with ongoing political influence and economic benefits. The North would get debt assumption, establishing the strong federal financial system that would fuel American economic growth. The compromise also included a provision that Philadelphia would serve as the temporary capital for 10 years while the new city was being built. This gave Northern interests a decade of continued influence while providing time to construct an entirely new seat of government from scratch. But why the Potomac River location specifically? The choice wasn't random or purely political. The site offered several practical advantages that made it attractive to the founders. The Potomac River was navigable by ocean-going ships as far as Georgetown, making it accessible to international trade and diplomacy. The location was roughly central to the existing 13 states, suggesting a government that wouldn't favour one region too heavily over another. More importantly, the site was close to George Washington's beloved Mount Vernon plantation. The first president took a personal interest in the capital's development that went far beyond his official duties. Washington had extensive knowledge of the Potomac River region from his years as a surveyor and land speculator, and he believed the area had enormous potential for future growth and development. The Potomac location also offered something that existing cities couldn't provide: a blank slate. Rather than adapting an existing city with its own established interests and power structures, the founders could build their ideal capital from the ground up. They could design streets, buildings, and institutions that would embody their vision of Republican government and American values. On July 16, 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act, officially establishing that the permanent seat of the United States government would be located in a federal district along the Potomac River. The act gave President Washington broad authority to select the exact location and oversee the capital's development, setting the stage for one of the most ambitious urban planning projects in world history. The die was cast. A new capital would rise from the Maryland and Virginia countryside, built not through organic growth over centuries, but through deliberate political will and careful design. This would be a city unlike any other in America, a place where every street and building would serve the larger purpose of housing and projecting federal power. Little did anyone realize that this swampy stretch of riverbank would eventually become the epicenter of global influence, a city whose decisions would affect billions of people around the world. The story of Washington, D.C. was just beginning, but already the forces of politics, compromise, and calculated ambition were shaping what would become one of the world's most powerful cities. 8 cities Washington had his location, but now came the monumental challenge of actually creating a city. The president faced a task that no American leader had ever attempted: building a national capital entirely from scratch on a timeline that seemed almost impossibly ambitious. The new city had to be ready to receive the federal government by 1800, giving planners just 10 years to transform rural farmland into a functioning seat of power. The first order of business was acquiring the land itself. The Residence Act had authorized a federal district of up to 100 square miles to be carved from territory donated by Maryland and Virginia. Washington selected a diamond-shaped area that encompassed existing settlements like Georgetown and Alexandria, but also included thousands of acres of undeveloped countryside along both sides of the Potomac River. Negotiating with local landowners proved to be a delicate and often frustrating process. Many property owners were reluctant to sell their land to the federal government, especially at the prices being offered. Others saw an opportunity to profit enormously from the government's urgent need for territory. Washington and his commissioners found themselves caught between congressional pressure to keep costs low and the reality that landowners held most of the bargaining power. The solution they devised was ingenious and would set important precedents for future government land acquisition. Rather than purchasing all the land outright, they negotiated agreements where landowners would donate half their property to the federal government in exchange for guaranteed ownership of the remaining half. The government would then sell building lots from the donated land to finance construction, while original landowners would benefit from the dramatic increase in property values that a new capital city would inevitably bring. This arrangement created an immediate community of stakeholders who had direct financial interests in the capital's success. Former farmers and plantation owners suddenly found themselves sitting on potentially valuable urban real estate, transforming them from skeptics into enthusiastic supporters of the project. It was a masterful example of aligning private interests with public goals. With the land question resolved, Washington turned to the equally challenging task of designing the new city. This wasn't simply a matter of laying out streets and designating building sites. The capital's physical layout would embody the political principles of the new republic and project American power to both domestic and foreign audiences. Every decision about streets, buildings, and public spaces carried symbolic weight that could influence how the world perceived American democracy. Washington knew he needed someone with both artistic vision and practical experience to tackle such an ambitious undertaking. After considering several candidates, he selected Pierre L'Enfant, a French engineer and artist who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War. L'Enfant had already demonstrated his talents by designing Federal Hall in New York, where Washington had been inaugurated as the first president. L'Enfant brought European sensibilities to American democratic ideals, creating a unique hybrid that would distinguish Washington from other world capitals. He had studied the great planned cities of Europe, from Paris with its grand boulevards to London with its elegant squares. But he also understood that the American capital needed to express different values than the monarchical cities of the Old World. The plan that L'Enfant developed was breathtakingly ambitious. He envisioned a city of broad avenues radiating from major public buildings, creating dramatic vistas that would inspire both residents and visitors. The Capitol building would sit on the highest point of land, symbolically and literally overlooking the entire city. The President's House, later known as the White House, would be positioned a mile away, connected to the Capitol by a grand avenue that would become Pennsylvania Avenue. Between these two centers of power, L'Enfant planned a vast public space that he called the Grand Avenue, which would eventually become the National Mall. This area was intended not just as parkland, but as a stage for the democracy itself, a place where citizens could gather to celebrate, protest, or simply contemplate their government. The symbolism was deliberate and profound. In monarchical capitals, grand spaces served to glorify kings and queens. But in Washington, the greatest public space would belong to the people themselves. The street layout itself embodied democratic principles. While European capitals often featured streets that radiated from royal palaces, emphasizing the monarch's central importance, L'Enfant created a grid system overlaid with diagonal avenues. This design meant that no single building or institution would dominate all the sightlines in the city. Power would be distributed rather than concentrated, reflected in the very bones of the urban landscape. L'Enfant also planned for a city much larger than anyone thought necessary at the time. His vision encompassed not just the immediate needs of the federal government, but anticipated centuries of growth and development. Critics mocked what they saw as grandiose overreach, but L'Enfant understood that capitals needed room to grow and evolve. He was designing not just for the America of 1790, but for the global power he believed the nation would eventually become. The scale of construction required was staggering. The new city would need government buildings, housing for officials and workers, infrastructure like roads and bridges, and all the commercial establishments necessary to support a functioning urban centre. Most challenging of all, everything had to be built simultaneously while the government continued operating in Philadelphia. Washington established a three-man commission to oversee the project, but he remained personally involved in virtually every major decision. He regularly travelled from Philadelphia to inspect construction progress, review architectural plans, and resolve disputes that constantly arose among the various parties involved in the project. The president understood that his personal reputation was tied to the capital's success, and he drove himself and everyone around him relentlessly to meet their deadlines. Finding skilled workers proved to be an enormous challenge. America in the 1790s simply didn't have enough trained stonemasons, carpenters, and other craftsmen to build a major city in just 10 years. The commissioners were forced to recruit workers from across Europe, offering generous wages and working conditions to attract the talent they needed. Skilled artisans from Scotland came to work on the sandstone facades of major buildings. Irish immigrants provided much of the manual labour for excavation and construction. German craftsmen brought expertise in specialised trades like plastering and metalwork. The workforce also included hundreds of enslaved African Americans, a troubling reality that complicated the capital's founding ideals from the very beginning. These enslaved workers quarried stone, cleared forests, and performed much of the back-breaking labour that made construction possible. Their unpaid work subsidised the creation of a capital supposedly dedicated to liberty and justice, creating moral contradictions that would haunt the city for generations. Despite the massive efforts and expense, progress was frustratingly slow. The commissioners constantly battled budget shortfalls as land sales failed to generate the revenue they had optimistically projected. Construction was repeatedly delayed by bad weather, material shortages, and labour disputes. By 1796, with just 4 years remaining before the government's scheduled move, many key buildings were still little more than foundations and partially completed walls. The situation became so dire that some members of Congress began discussing whether to abandon the Potomac site entirely and relocate the capital to an existing city that could accommodate the government immediately. Philadelphia's leaders lobbied intensively to make their temporary arrangement permanent, while other cities positioned themselves as alternatives if the Washington project collapsed completely. Washington refused to consider retreat. He understood that abandoning the project would be seen as a fundamental failure of American capabilities, suggesting that the young republic lacked the resources and determination to complete major undertakings. More personally, he had invested enormous amounts of his own time, energy, and reputation in the capital's success. Failure would tarnish his legacy and undermine confidence in American institutions. The race against time intensified as the 1800 deadline approached. Construction crews worked through winters that would normally halt building activity. The commissioners borrowed money against future land sales, gambling that the city's eventual success would justify their mounting debts. Quality suffered as speed became the overriding priority, with buildings completed just enough to be functional rather than finished to the standards originally envisioned. As the final months of the Philadelphia period ticked away, it became clear that the new capital would be far from complete when the government arrived. The Capitol building had one wing partially finished, but the dome and much of the structure remained unbuilt. The President's house was habitable but unfinished, lacking many basic amenities. Most government departments would have to operate from temporary quarters scattered throughout the small city. The broader city was even less ready for its new role. Many streets existed only on L'Enfant's plan, remaining as muddy paths through partially cleared forests. Housing for government workers was scarce and expensive. Basic services like water supply and waste removal were primitive at best. The Grand Capitol, envisioned by L'Enfant and Washington, looked more like a construction site interrupted by a few scattered buildings. Yet there was no turning back. In the summer of 1800, as John Adams prepared to become the first president to govern from the new capital, wagons loaded with government records and furniture began making their way south from Philadelphia. The great experiment was about to begin, ready or not. The move itself was a logistical nightmare that tested every aspect of the new government's organizational capabilities. Federal departments packed their records into hundreds of wooden crates, loading them onto wagons for the bumpy journey south along primitive roads. The Treasury Department alone required dozens of wagons to transport its financial records, while the War Department struggled to relocate its maps, correspondence, and military supplies without disrupting ongoing operations. President John Adams made the journey in November 1800, becoming the first chief executive to take up residence in the unfinished President's house. His wife Abigail arrived a few days later and was appalled by what she found. The building lacked proper heating, many rooms remained unplastered, and the surrounding grounds were a muddy construction site littered with building materials and work sheds. In her famous letters, Abigail Adams described hanging the presidential laundry in the unfinished East Room, the only space large enough for the purpose, she wrote, of navigating through rooms where workmen were still installing windows, and complained about the difficulty of finding her way through the building's maze of unfinished corridors. The first family was essentially camping in what was supposed to be the grandest residence in America. Congress faced even greater challenges when they convened for the first time in the new Capitol building. Only the North Wing had been completed, forcing both the House and Senate to squeeze into temporary chambers that were barely adequate for their needs. The building lacked proper acoustics, making it difficult for members to hear debates. Heating was inadequate during the harsh winter of 1800 to 1801, and members frequently complained about drafts and uncomfortable conditions. The surrounding city offered little relief from these hardships. Most government officials found themselves living in boarding houses that were hastily constructed and poorly maintained. The streets were often impassable during rainy weather, turning into rivers of mud that could trap carriages and horses. Basic amenities like restaurants, shops, and entertainment were scarce, leading many officials to describe their new home as a hardship posting rather than the seat of a great nation. Foreign diplomats were particularly harsh in their assessments of the new capital. The British minister described Washington as a collection of scattered buildings connected by muddy paths through a wilderness. French representatives complained about the lack of social and cultural amenities that they expected to find in a national capital. These criticisms stung American leaders who understood that the capital's appearance reflected on the nation's credibility and capabilities. Despite these immediate challenges, the basic framework of American government began functioning in its new home. The Supreme Court convened for the first time in Washington in February 1801, meeting in a small chamber in the Capitol's basement cabinet departments established their operations in rented buildings throughout the small city. The Postal Service, customs houses, and other federal agencies began the complex process of relocating their personnel and operations. The transition coincided with one of the most significant political developments in American history, the election of 1800 and the peaceful transfer of power from the Federalist Party to Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. This change of administrations would have been challenging under any circumstances, but conducting it in an unfinished capital added layers of complexity that tested the new democracy's resilience. Jefferson's inauguration in March 1801 was deliberately modest, reflecting both the new president's democratic principles and the practical limitations of the unfinished city. Rather than the elaborate ceremony that might have taken place in Philadelphia or New York, Jefferson walked from his boarding house to the Capitol, delivered a brief inaugural address, and returned to his temporary quarters with minimal fanfare. The simplicity was partly necessity, but it also established a precedent for a Republican restraint that would influence future administrations. The new president brought a different vision for the Capitol's development than his predecessors had embraced. While Washington and Adams had favored grand European-style architecture and formal planning, Jefferson preferred a more understated approach that he believed better reflected American democratic values. He worried that too much magnificence would create the wrong impression about American government, suggesting aristocratic pretensions rather than Republican simplicity. Jefferson's architectural preferences would profoundly influence the Capitol's continued development. He favored classical Greek and Roman styles that evoked ancient republics rather than modern monarchies. The president personally involved himself in design decisions, working with architects to ensure that government buildings projected dignity without ostentation. His vision emphasized functionality and symbolic appropriateness over pure grandeur. Under Jefferson's guidance, work continued on completing the Capitol building and other essential structures. The President's House received ongoing improvements, including the addition of proper heating systems and finished interior spaces. New government buildings were constructed to house the growing federal bureaucracy, though always within Jefferson's guidelines for Republican appropriateness. The city's infrastructure also began to improve during Jefferson's presidency. Streets were graded and paved, making travel less treacherous during bad weather. A proper water supply system was installed, ending the early residents' dependence on wells and cisterns. Markets and commercial establishments opened to serve the growing population of government workers and their families. Yet progress remained frustratingly slow, and the capital continued to face serious challenges. The population grew gradually, reaching about 8,000 residents by 1810, but this was still far smaller than other major American cities. Economic development lagged because the city's economy depended almost entirely on government spending, creating boom and bust cycles tied to congressional sessions and federal appropriations. The cultural and social life that Jefferson and others had hoped would flourish in the capital was slow to develop. The city lacked the theaters, libraries, and social institutions that made places like Philadelphia and Boston attractive to educated elites. Many government officials continued to view their Washington service as temporary duty, maintaining their primary residences and social connections in other cities. These limitations became painfully apparent during the War of 1812, when Washington's vulnerability and isolation were exposed in dramatic fashion. In August 1814, British forces marched virtually unopposed into the American capital, burning the Capitol, the President's House, and other government buildings in retaliation for American attacks on York in Canada. The burning of Washington was a humiliating blow to American prestige and a stark demonstration of the capital's continued weaknesses. The city's small population and limited defences had made it an easy target for enemy forces. The destruction of key government buildings interrupted federal operations and forced officials to scramble for alternative meeting spaces and working arrangements. President James Madison and his administration were forced to flee the city as British forces approached, highlighting the capital's failure to provide adequate security for the nation's leadership. The famous story of Dolly Madison saving George Washington's portrait from the burning president's house became a symbol of individual heroism in the face of institutional failure. The British occupation lasted only a few days, but the damage was extensive. The capital's interior was completely gutted, destroying the Library of Congress and leaving the building as little more than a burned shell. The president's house was so severely damaged that it required complete reconstruction of its interior. Other government buildings suffered similar fates, setting back the capital's development by years. In the aftermath of the attack, some members of Congress again proposed abandoning Washington and relocating the capital to a more secure and established city. Philadelphia, New York, and other cities lobbied intensively for the honor, arguing that the burning demonstrated Washington's fundamental unsuitability as a national capital. The debate raged for months, with sectional tensions again threatening to tear the young nation apart. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate ultimately reflected both practical considerations and symbolic commitments. Moving the capital would have required enormous expense and political negotiations that might have proven impossible to complete. More importantly, abandoning Washington would have represented a victory for the British and a fundamental admission of American weakness that could have undermined the nation's international standing. The reconstruction effort that followed the War of 1812 marked a turning point in Washington's development. The federal government committed substantial resources to rebuilding and improving the capital, viewing it as essential to national prestige and security. The capital was reconstructed with improved fireproofing and security features, while the president's house was rebuilt and expanded with better defensive considerations. This period also saw the beginning of more systematic urban planning and infrastructure development. Streets were improved and extended, connecting previously isolated neighborhoods and making the city more navigable. Parks and public spaces were developed to provide recreational opportunities for residents and visitors. Commercial districts began to emerge, reducing the city's complete dependence on government employment. The population began growing more rapidly as well, reaching nearly 24,000 residents by 1820. This growth included not only government workers and their families, but also the merchants, craftsmen, and service providers needed to support a functioning city. For the first time, Washington began to feel like a real urban centre rather than just a government outpost in the wilderness. Yet significant challenges remained as the capital entered its third decade. The economy was still heavily dependent on government spending, making it vulnerable to political changes and budget cut social and cultural life, while improving remained limited compared to other major cities. Most fundamentally, the institution of slavery continued to cast a shadow over a capital supposedly dedicated to liberty and equality. The presence of slavery in the District of Columbia created ongoing moral and political contradictions that would only intensify as the nation expanded westward. Slave markets operated within sight of the capital, while enslaved people performed much of the labor that kept the city functioning. These contradictions would eventually contribute to the sectional tensions that culminated in the Civil War, transforming Washington from a symbol of national unity into a contested prize in an existential struggle over the nation's future. By the 1830s, Washington was beginning to find its rhythm as a functioning capital, though it remained a city of stark contrasts and unresolved tensions. The population had swelled to over 30,000 residents, creating a more diverse urban community that extended far beyond government workers. Merchants, laborers, free blacks, and enslaved people all contributed to a complex social fabric that reflected the broader contradictions of American democracy. The city's physical transformation during this period was remarkable. Pennsylvania Avenue had finally been properly paved and lined with trees, creating the grand processional route that L'Enfant had envisioned decades earlier. The Capitol building received its first proper dome, though not the magnificent structure we see today. Government departments expanded into purpose-built offices, ending the era of scattered operations in rented spaces throughout the city. Yet beneath this surface, progress lay deeper problems that would soon threaten the capital's very existence. The slavery question was becoming impossible to ignore, particularly in a city where enslaved people comprised nearly a quarter of the population. Slave pens and auction blocks operated within walking distance of the halls where congressmen debated the principles of human freedom and equality. The contradiction was not lost on visitors, especially foreign observers who noted the jarring juxtaposition of democratic rhetoric and human bondage. Charles Dickens, during his 1842 visit, wrote scathingly about the hypocrisy of a capital where liberty was proclaimed while people were bought and sold like livestock. These criticisms wounded American pride and undermined the moral authority that the young republic sought to project to the world. The economic dependence on slave labor extended throughout the capital's infrastructure. Enslaved workers maintained the streets, constructed public buildings, and provided domestic service in the homes of government officials. The profits from their unpaid labor helped finance the city's continued development, creating a foundation built literally on human exploitation. Free African Americans in Washington faced their own challenges, existing in a precarious legal and social position. While not enslaved, they lived under restrictive laws that limited their movement, employment opportunities, and civil rights. Many worked as artisans, laborers, or domestic servants, but they could never be certain that their freedom would be respected. Kidnapping of free blacks for sale into slavery was a constant threat that haunted the community. The presence of both enslaved and free African Americans created a vibrant but vulnerable community that would play a crucial role in the capital's future. Churches, schools, and mutual aid societies provided support networks and cultural institutions that sustained the community through decades of legal and social oppression. These organizations would later become important centers of resistance and political organization as the slavery question reached its climax. Meanwhile, the federal government itself was growing in size and complexity, requiring ever more space and resources. New departments were created to handle the expanding responsibilities of a continental nation. The Postal Service, customs operations, and military administration all needed larger facilities and more personnel. This growth created opportunities for some residents, while straining the city's limited infrastructure. The 1840s brought new challenges as the nation's westward expansion intensified debates over slavery's future. Washington found itself at the center of increasingly bitter political battles that would determine whether new territories would be slave or free. The Compromise of 1850 included provisions specifically addressing slavery in the District of Columbia, highlighting how local issues in the capital had become matters of national significance. Under the Compromise, the slave trade was abolished in Washington, though slavery itself remained legal. This partial measure satisfied no one completely, but demonstrated how the capital's peculiar status made it a focal point for broader national tensions. Slave auctions could no longer take place in the city, but enslaved people continued to live and work throughout the district under the same harsh conditions as before. The abolition of the slave trade brought some relief to critics who had long pointed to the moral contradiction of human trafficking in the nation's capital. Yet, it also highlighted the federal government's limited power to address slavery more comprehensively. The Compromise revealed both the potential and the limitations of political solutions to moral problems. During this same period, the capital experienced significant cultural and intellectual growth. The Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846, creating the first major center for scientific research and education in Washington. The institution's imposing red sandstone building, known as the Castle, added architectural distinction to the National Mall while symbolizing America's growing commitment to learning and discovery. The Smithsonian's founding reflected the capital's evolving identity beyond its purely governmental functions. Scientists, researchers, and intellectuals began viewing Washington as a legitimate center of American cultural life, rather than merely a political necessity. This transformation would accelerate in the coming decades as the city developed the institutions and amenities expected of a major capital. Transportation improvements also began connecting Washington more effectively to the rest of the nation. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reached the capital in 1835, dramatically reducing travel time to northern cities and improving communication with distant parts of the country. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, completed in sections throughout the 1830s and 1840s, provided reliable freight transportation along the Potomac River. These transportation links helped reduce Washington's isolation and integrated it more fully into the national economy. Government officials could now travel more easily between the capital and their home districts, while businesses could ship goods and receive supplies more efficiently. The improvements also brought more visitors to the city, exposing broader audiences to the capital and its institutions. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 tested the capital's ability to coordinate a major military effort, while highlighting the ongoing tensions over slavery's expansion. Washington served as the command center for military operations stretching across half a continent, demonstrating the federal government's growing capacity to project power over vast distances. War planning, supply coordination, and diplomatic negotiations all flowed through the capital's government offices. Yet the war's aftermath intensified the very political divisions that threatened to tear the nation apart. The acquisition of vast new territories in the Southwest forced Americans to confront fundamental questions about slavery's future that could no longer be postponed or compromised away. These debates would rage through the halls of the capital with increasing bitterness and violence. The 1850s brought a sense of impending crisis that permeated every aspect of life. In Washington, political rhetoric became more inflammatory, and physical confrontations between congressmen reflected the broader breakdown of civil discourse. The famous caning of Senator Charles Sumner by Representative Preston Brooks in 1856 shocked the nation and demonstrated how political violence was infiltrating even the highest levels of government. The capital's residents found themselves living at the epicenter of a national emergency that seemed to worsen with each passing year. Families were divided by political loyalties, while businesses struggled to navigate the uncertain political environment. The city that had been designed to embody national unity was becoming a symbol of irreconcilable division. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 brought these tensions to a breaking point. As southern states began seceding from the Union, Washington found itself in an extraordinarily precarious position. The capital was surrounded by slave states, including Maryland and Virginia, which had originally donated the land for the district. If these states joined the Confederacy, Washington would be completely cut off from the loyal states of the North. The months between Lincoln's election and inauguration were filled with rumors of plots to prevent the new president from reaching the Capitol alive. Reports circulated of plans to assassinate Lincoln during his journey to Washington, or to seize control of the city before he could take office. The federal government began taking unprecedented security measures to protect both the Capitol and the incoming administration. When Lincoln finally arrived in Washington in February 1861, he found a city paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. Government workers from the southern states were resigning their positions in droves, while others remained but under suspicion of divided loyalties. The military garrison was small and of questionable reliability, with many officers facing agonizing decisions about whether to remain loyal to the Union or follow their states into rebellion. The atmosphere in Washington during those final weeks before the war was electric with tension and anticipation. Everyone understood that momentous events were unfolding, but no one could predict exactly what form they would take. The capital that had been built to house a unified nation now stood as a potential prize in what increasingly appeared to be an inevitable civil war. As Lincoln prepared for his inauguration, he faced the daunting challenge of preserving both the Union and its capital in the face of unprecedented threats. The ceremony itself would need to be conducted under heavy security, with sharpshooters positioned on nearby buildings and soldiers lining the parade route. The peaceful transfer of power that had defined American democracy for decades was about to be tested as never before. The inauguration of Abraham Lincoln on March 4, 1861, marked not just the beginning of a new administration, but the start of the most perilous period in Washington's history. The capital would soon find itself transformed from a sleepy government town into a fortress city, the nerve center of a war that would determine not only the fate of the Union, but the future of democracy itself. The stage was set for Washington's greatest trial, a test that would either destroy the capital that the founders had built, or forge it into something far more powerful and significant than they had ever imagined. The city's survival would depend not just on military might, but on the strength of the democratic ideals that had brought it into existence in the first place. The bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, sent shockwaves through Washington that reverberated through every government building and private residence. Within hours of receiving the telegraph reports, the capital began its transformation from a peacetime seat of government into a wartime command center. Lincoln and his cabinet worked through the night, coordinating responses to the crisis while grappling with the immediate threat to the capital itself. The geography that had once made Washington attractive as a neutral location between North and South now became a strategic nightmare. Virginia's secession on April 17th placed Confederate territory directly across the Potomac River from the capital, while Maryland's loyalties remained uncertain. If Maryland joined the Confederacy, Washington would be completely surrounded by enemy territory, cut off from reinforcements and supplies from the loyal states. The first troops to reach Washington were the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, which arrived on April 19th after fighting their way through hostile crowds in Baltimore. The soldiers' bloody passage through Maryland's largest city highlighted the capital's vulnerability and raised serious questions about whether additional reinforcements could reach the city at all. For several terrifying days, Washington felt completely isolated, a small island of federal authority in a sea of rebellion. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion triggered a massive mobilization effort that would reshape Washington's character permanently. The sleepy government town, with its 60,000 residents, suddenly found itself hosting an ever-growing army that would eventually swell to over 100,000 troops. Every available space was converted to military use, from government buildings to private homes and even churches. The transformation was remarkable and often chaotic. The Patent Office became a barracks for soldiers, while the Capitol building itself housed troops in its corridors and chambers. The unfinished dome of the Capitol was used as a bakery for army bread, creating the surreal image of smoke rising from the seat of American democracy. The contrast between the building's symbolic importance and its practical military use perfectly captured the Capitol's wartime transformation. Military camps sprouted throughout the district and in the surrounding countryside, Soldiers drilled on the National Mall, turning L'Enfant's grand public space into a parade ground for citizen soldiers learning the arts of war. The romantic notions of quick victory that had initially motivated volunteers gave way to the grim realities of military preparation as it became clear that the conflict would not end quickly or easily. The massive influx of soldiers, government workers, and war contractors created unprecedented challenges for the capital's infrastructure. Housing became desperately scarce, with rents skyrocketing and families crowding into spaces never intended for so many residents. The city's primitive sanitation systems were overwhelmed, creating health hazards that would plague Washington throughout the war years. Food supplies, transportation networks, and basic services all struggled to meet the demands of a population that had tripled almost overnight. Entrepreneurs rushed to exploit the opportunities created by wartime demand, while profiteers and swindlers followed close behind. The capital that had once prided itself on Republican simplicity now buzzed with the frantic energy of a boomtown, driven by the terrible economics of warfare. Women played increasingly important roles in this transformed capital, breaking traditional barriers as they took on responsibilities that men could no longer fulfill. They worked in government offices, managed businesses, and organized relief efforts for wounded soldiers. The war created opportunities for women to demonstrate capabilities that had been denied or ignored in peacetime, fundamentally altering social expectations and relationships throughout the city. Clara Barton emerged as one of the most prominent figures in this transformation, organizing medical supplies and nursing care for wounded soldiers. Her work highlighted both the vital contributions that women made to the war effort and the inadequacy of existing institutions to handle the conflict's human costs. The makeshift hospitals that sprouted throughout Washington bore witness to both individual heroism and systemic failures. The capital's African-American community faced the war's impact with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The conflict offered the possibility of freedom and full citizenship, but also brought immediate dangers and uncertainties. Enslaved people throughout the region began fleeing to Washington, seeking protection behind Union lines and creating a refugee crisis that tested the government's commitment to emancipation. These refugees, known as contrabands, settled in camps throughout the district, creating new communities while straining the city's limited resources. Their presence forced Washington residents to confront the reality of slavery's human cost, while highlighting the contradictions that had plagued the capital since its founding. The camps became centers of both hope and desperation, places where freedom's promise met the harsh realities of wartime displacement. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 transformed these contradictions into opportunities for fundamental change. The president had already signed legislation ending slavery in the District of Columbia in April 1862, making the capital a beacon of freedom for enslaved people throughout the region. The symbolic importance of ending bondage in the seat of American democracy resonated far beyond the district's boundaries. The practical effects were immediate and profound. Thousands of formerly enslaved people found themselves legally free but economically vulnerable, struggling to build new lives while facing continued discrimination and limited opportunities. Churches, schools, and mutual aid societies worked to provide support and guidance, but the challenges were enormous and the resources inadequate. Meanwhile, the military situation around Washington continued to evolve as both Union and Confederate forces recognized the capital's strategic importance. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland in September 1862 brought enemy forces within striking distance of the capital, creating panic among residents and government officials. The Battle of Antietam ended Lee's immediate threat, but demonstrated how quickly the war could reach Washington's doorstep. The capital's defenses were systematically strengthened throughout 1862 and 1863, creating a ring of fortifications that would eventually include 68 forts connected by roads and telegraph lines. These defensive works required enormous amounts of labour and materials, providing employment for thousands of workers while fundamentally altering the landscape around the city. The peaceful countryside that had once surrounded Washington was transformed into a militarized zone of earthworks, camps, and defensive positions. The most dramatic test of these defenses came in July 1864, when Confederate General Jubal Early's forces approached within sight of the Capitol dome. Early's raid represented the closest that Confederate forces ever came to capturing the Union Capitol, and the threat was serious enough to bring President Lincoln himself to observe the fighting at Fort Stevens. The sight of the president under enemy fire highlighted both the personal courage that the war demanded and the very real possibility that the Capitol might fall. The successful defense of Washington during Early's raid marked a turning point in the Capitol's war experience. The immediate threat to the city's survival had passed, though the broader war continued to rage across the continent. Washington's transformation from vulnerable government town to fortified command center was complete, and the city had proven its ability to survive the ultimate test of warfare. The human cost of this transformation was staggering. Hospitals throughout the capital treated hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers, while cemeteries expanded to accommodate the war's terrible toll. Arlington Cemetery, established on the former estate of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, became a powerful symbol of the war's cost and the Union's determination to honor its fallen defenders. Walt Whitman, who served as a hospital volunteer in Washington during the war, captured the Capitol's transformed character in his poetry and prose. His descriptions of wounded soldiers, overworked medical staff, and grieving families painted a portrait of a city that had been fundamentally changed by its wartime experience. The romantic notions of Republican simplicity that had once defined Washington gave way to a harder, more complex reality shaped by industrial warfare and human suffering. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, brought this traumatic period to a shocking conclusion. The president's murder at Ford's Theater, just blocks from the White House, demonstrated that even in the moment of victory, Washington remained vulnerable to the hatreds that the war had unleashed. The capital that had survived Confederate armies and political upheaval now faced the challenge of moving forward without the leader who had guided it through its darkest hours. Lincoln's funeral procession through Washington streets became a defining moment in the capital's history, as hundreds of thousands of mourners gathered to honor the fallen president. The elaborate ceremony, with its horse-drawn hearse and military honors, marked both an ending and a beginning for the city that Lincoln had worked so hard to preserve. The capital would survive, but it would never again be the simple government town that the founders had envisioned. The war's end brought new challenges as Washington struggled to transition from a military command center back to a peacetime capital. The massive armies that had protected the city were demobilized, while war contractors and temporary workers faced uncertain futures. The economic boom that had sustained the capital during the conflict gave way to uncertainty about what role Washington would play in the reunited nation. Yet the war had also fundamentally strengthened both the federal government and its capital city. The successful coordination of a continental war effort had demonstrated the effectiveness of centralized administration and the importance of having a strong national capital. Washington had proven that it could serve as more than just a meeting place for politicians. It could function as the nerve center of a modern nation-state. The physical infrastructure created during the war years provided a foundation for continued growth and development. The expanded government buildings, improved transportation networks, and defensive fortifications all contributed to the capital's enhanced capacity to serve the nation's needs. More importantly, the war had created a sense of shared purpose and national identity that would help sustain Washington through the challenges ahead. The capital that emerged from the Civil War was vastly different from the city that had existed in 1860. It was larger, more complex, and more important to the nation's functioning than ever before. The population had grown dramatically and become more diverse, incorporating refugees from slavery, war veterans, and immigrants from around the world. This diversity would become one of Washington's defining characteristics in the decades to come. The war had also established important precedents for federal power and the capital's role in American life. The successful use of Washington as a command center for military operations, economic coordination, and political leadership had demonstrated the potential for strong central government. These precedents would prove crucial as the nation faced the challenges of Reconstruction, industrialization, and eventual emergence as a global power. Perhaps most importantly, the war had resolved the fundamental contradiction that had plagued Washington since its founding. The end of slavery in the District of Columbia had eliminated the most glaring inconsistency between the capital's symbolic role and its actual practices. While racial discrimination would continue for generations, the legal framework of human bondage had finally been dismantled in the seat of American democracy. As Washington entered the Reconstruction era, it carried both the scars and the strengths that 4 years of civil war had created. The capital had survived its greatest test and emerged as a more powerful and significant city than its founders could have imagined. The stage was set for Washington's transformation into a truly national capital, worthy of the continental empire that the United States was rapidly becoming. The challenges ahead would be enormous, from rebuilding the shattered South to managing rapid industrialization and immigration. But Washington had proven its resilience and adaptability, qualities that would serve it well as it prepared to guide the nation through the complex decades of growth and change that lay ahead. And change that lay ahead. The Reconstruction era that followed Lincoln's assassination thrust Washington into a role it had never before occupied, the administrative center of a massive social and political transformation. The federal government suddenly found itself responsible for rebuilding an entire region while simultaneously redefining the meaning of American citizenship for millions of formerly enslaved people. This unprecedented challenge would test every institution in the capital and fundamentally reshape the city's relationship with the rest of the nation. The immediate aftermath of the war brought chaos to Washington streets as demobilized soldiers, freed slaves, and displaced civilians all converged on the capital, seeking assistance, employment, or simply a place to start over. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, operated from a sprawling complex of temporary buildings that processed thousands of cases daily. Former slaves arrived with nothing but hope, while Confederate veterans sought pardons and the restoration of their property rights. The collision of these competing needs created tensions that permeated every aspect of life in the capital. President Andrew Johnson's approach to Reconstruction quickly brought him into conflict with the radical Republicans who controlled Congress, turning Washington into a battlefield of competing visions for America's future. The impeachment proceedings against Johnson in 1868 represented the culmination of these tensions, as the Capitol became the stage for a constitutional crisis that threatened to paralyze the federal government entirely. The House of Representatives' vote to impeach Johnson sent shockwaves through Washington's political establishment. The subsequent Senate trial drew national attention to the Capitol as never before, with senators deliberating whether to remove a sitting president for the first time in American history. The proceedings revealed deep divisions not only about Reconstruction policy, but about the fundamental balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. During these turbulent years, Washington's population continued to grow rapidly as the expanding federal bureaucracy required ever more workers to administer reconstruction programs. The Pension Office processed claims from hundreds of thousands of Union veterans, while the Treasury Department managed the enormous debts incurred during the war. New government buildings sprouted throughout the city to house these expanded operations, fundamentally altering the capital's skyline and character. The completion of the Capitol Dome in 1866 provided a powerful symbol of national unity at a time when the country remained deeply divided. The massive cast-iron structure, crowned by the Statue of Freedom, dominated Washington's landscape and could be seen for miles in every direction. The dome's completion represented not just architectural achievement, but a statement about the permanence and authority of the federal government that had survived its greatest challenge. Yet beneath this impressive facade, Washington struggled with problems that reflected the broader difficulties of Reconstruction. Racial tensions remained high despite the legal end of slavery, with many white residents resenting the growing political influence of African Americans in the district. The capital's schools, churches, and neighborhoods remained largely segregated, creating parallel societies that had little contact with each other despite their geographic proximity. The expansion of voting rights to African American men in 1867 transformed Washington's political landscape in ways that sent ripples throughout the South. Black men not only voted in large numbers, but also won election to significant offices, including seats on the City Council and the Board of Education. These electoral victories demonstrated the potential for meaningful political participation that Reconstruction promised, while also generating fierce resistance from those who opposed racial equality. Alexander Shepard emerged as one of the most influential figures in Washington's post-war development, serving first as vice president and then president of the Board of Public Works. Shepard launched an ambitious program of urban improvements that included paving streets, installing gas lighting, and creating a comprehensive sewer system. His efforts transformed Washington from a muddy provincial town into a modern city worthy of its role as the national capital. The scale of Shepard's improvements was breathtaking. More than 180 miles of streets were paved, while 200 miles of sidewalks were constructed throughout the district. Gas lighting illuminated the major thoroughfares for the first time, extending the hours when business and social activities could safely take place. The installation of water and sewer systems eliminated many of the health hazards that had plagued the capital since its founding. However, these improvements came at an enormous cost that nearly bankrupted the district government. Shepard's ambitious projects required massive borrowing that far exceeded the local government's ability to repay. By 1874, the district's debt had reached crisis proportions, forcing Congress to intervene and essentially take direct control of Washington's governance. This intervention marked the end of the capital's experiment with local self-government and established a pattern of congressional oversight that would persist for more than a century. The financial crisis that ended Shepard's reign also reflected broader economic problems that affected the entire nation during the 1870s. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe depression that lasted for several years, causing widespread unemployment and business failures throughout the country. Washington felt these effects acutely, as reduced federal spending and the curtailment of public works projects eliminated thousands of jobs in the capital. Despite these economic difficulties, the 1870s saw continued growth in Washington's cultural and intellectual institutions. The Corcoran Gallery of Art opened in 1874, providing the capital with its first major art museum and establishing Washington as a center for American artistic culture. The National Zoo was founded in 1889, creating a major attraction that drew visitors from throughout the country while contributing to scientific research and conservation efforts. The establishment of these cultural institutions reflected Washington's growing maturity as a true national capital rather than merely a government outpost. The city was developing the amenities and attractions that would make it a destination in its own right, not just a necessary stop for those conducting business with the federal government. This transformation helped attract a more diverse population of residents who chose to make Washington their permanent home, rather than viewing it as a temporary assignment. The completion of the Washington Monument in 1884 provided another powerful symbol of the capital's evolution and the nation's recovery from civil war. The massive obelisk had been under construction for decades, with work repeatedly interrupted by funding shortages and political disputes. Its completion represented not just architectural achievement, but national persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The monument's dedication ceremony drew enormous crowds to the National Mall, including President Chester Arthur and representatives from around the world. The event marked Washington's emergence as a city capable of hosting major international gatherings while celebrating American achievements and values. The site of the completed monument, rising 555 feet above the Potomac River, provided a focal point for national pride and unity. The 1880s brought renewed economic growth to Washington as the federal government expanded its role in regulating interstate commerce, managing Western development, and conducting foreign relations. New cabinet departments were created to handle these responsibilities, requiring additional office space and personnel. The State, War, and Navy Building, now known as the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, was completed during this period, providing the executive branch with much-needed space while showcasing the government's growing ambitions. This massive structure, with its elaborate Second Empire architecture and nearly 600 rooms, represented a dramatic departure from the Republican simplicity that had once characterized Washington's government buildings. Critics complained that the building's ornate facade and luxurious appointments were inappropriate for a democratic government, but supporters argued that the United States deserved buildings that reflected its growing power and influence on the world stage. The expansion of the federal bureaucracy during this period created new opportunities for employment that attracted workers from throughout the country. Government clerks, stenographers, and administrators found steady work in Washington's growing departments, while the city's service sector expanded to meet their needs. Hotels, restaurants, and shops proliferated throughout the capital, creating a more diverse and dynamic urban economy. Women found increasing opportunities for employment in the federal government during the 1880s and 1890s, though usually in subordinate positions as clerks and typists. The introduction of typewriters and other office machinery created demand for workers with specific technical skills, and women often proved adept at mastering these new technologies. While they faced significant discrimination and were paid less than male colleagues, government employment offered many women unprecedented independence and economic security. The capital's transportation networks also underwent significant improvements during this period. The completion of additional railroad lines connecting Washington to other major cities reduced travel times and improved communication with distant parts of the country street. Railways within the city made it easier for residents to move between neighborhoods, encouraging suburban development and reducing the overcrowding that had characterized earlier decades. These transportation improvements helped integrate Washington more fully into the national economy, while making the capital more accessible to visitors from around the country. Business travelers, tourists, and immigrants all found it easier to reach Washington, contributing to the city's growing cosmopolitan character. The capital was becoming less isolated and more connected to the broader currents of American life. The 1890s brought new challenges as massive waves of immigration transformed American cities throughout the country. While Washington received fewer immigrants than cities like New York or Chicago, the capital's foreign-born population grew significantly. During this period, Italian stonemasons worked on government construction projects, while Irish immigrants found employment in the city's expanding service sector. These new residents added to Washington's diversity, while sometimes creating tensions with established communities. The Spanish-American War of 1898 once again transformed Washington into a military command center, though on a smaller scale than during the Civil War. The capital coordinated military operations in Cuba and the Philippines while managing the complex logistics of overseas warfare. The successful conduct of these operations demonstrated the federal government's enhanced capacity to project power across oceans, marking America's emergence as a global imperial power. The acquisition of overseas territories following the Spanish-American War created new administrative challenges that further expanded the federal government's role and size. The War Department established new bureaus to manage colonial affairs, while the Navy Department coordinated the defense of America's far-flung possessions. These expanded responsibilities required additional personnel and office space, contributing to Washington's continued growth and development. The turn of the 20th century found Washington poised for its greatest transformation yet. The capital had survived civil war, economic depression, and rapid social change, while growing from a small government town into a major American city. The federal government's expanding role in national and international affairs would soon require even more dramatic changes, setting the stage for Washington's emergence as one of the world's most important capitals. The Macmillan Commission, established in 1900 to develop a comprehensive plan for the capital's future development, would soon propose changes that would reshape Washington's physical appearance and symbolic meaning. The Commission's recommendations would transform the National Mall into the grand ceremonial space we know today, while establishing architectural standards that would define federal buildings for generations to come. As the new century began, Washington stood ready to assume its role as the capital of a global power. The foundations had been laid through decades of growth, conflict, and transformation. The city that had once struggled simply to house the basic functions of Republican government was preparing to become the nerve center of an empire that would shape the course of world history. The challenges ahead would test Washington's institutions and infrastructure in ways that its founders could never have imagined. But the capital had already proven its resilience and adaptability through the trials of civil war and Reconstruction. These qualities would serve it well as it prepared to guide America through the complex responsibilities of global leadership that the 20th century would bring. The stage was set for Washington's final transformation from a national capital into a world capital, a city whose decisions would affect not just Americans, but people throughout the globe. The provincial government town that had struggled to attract residents and maintain basic services was about to become one of the most powerful and influential cities on Earth. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a vision that would fundamentally reshape Washington's identity and purpose. The Macmillan Commission's comprehensive plan, unveiled in 1902, represented nothing less than a complete reimagining of the capital as a grand stage for American power. Led by Senator James Macmillan of Michigan, the commission included some of the nation's most prominent architects and planners, including Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and Charles McKim. Their proposal was breathtakingly ambitious. The commission envisioned transforming the National Mall from a cluttered collection of railroad tracks, markets, and miscellaneous buildings into a magnificent ceremonial corridor stretching from the Capitol to the Potomac River. This grand axis would be lined with the neoclassical buildings housing the expanding federal bureaucracy, creating a visual representation of American democratic ideals and growing international influence. The plan drew inspiration from the great capitals of Europe, particularly the redesigned Paris of Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann. Yet the commissioners were careful to adapt these European models to American democratic values, creating spaces that would inspire citizens rather than intimidate them. The result would be a uniquely American interpretation of monumental architecture, one that celebrated Republican government while acknowledging the nation's emergence as a world power. The Commission's recommendations faced immediate resistance from practical-minded congressmen who questioned both the enormous cost and the apparent departure from American traditions of governmental simplicity. Critics argued that such grandiose planning was more appropriate for monarchies than republics, and that the money would be better spent on practical improvements to infrastructure and services. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about what kind of image America should project to the world. President Theodore Roosevelt threw his considerable political weight behind the Macmillan Plan, recognizing that the capital's physical appearance had important implications for American prestige and influence. Roosevelt understood that in an era of growing international competition, nations were judged not only by their military and economic power, but also by their cultural achievements and architectural grandeur. A shabby capital would undermine America's claims to great power status. The implementation of the Macmillan Plan would take decades and require enormous political skill to navigate congressional appropriations and bureaucratic resistance. The first major victory came with the construction of Union Station, completed in 1907 as the largest train station in the world. The magnificent Beaux-Arts structure served not only as a transportation hub, but as a grand gateway to the capital, ensuring that visitors' first impression of Washington would be one of impressive scale and architectural sophistication. The station's vast waiting room, with its barrel-vaulted ceiling and marble columns, was designed to evoke the grandeur of ancient Rome while celebrating modern American engineering achievements. The building's scale and ornamentation sent a clear message about American ambitions and capabilities, establishing a template for future federal construction projects throughout the capital. Meanwhile, the federal government itself continued expanding at an unprecedented pace. The creation of new cabinet departments and regulatory agencies required ever more office space and personnel, straining the capital's existing infrastructure. The Department of Agriculture moved into an enormous new building complex, while the Bureau of Engraving and Printing expanded its operations to meet the growing demand for currency and government securities. These expansions reflected the fundamental transformation of the federal government's role in American life. What had once been a small institution, focused primarily on defense and foreign relations, was becoming a complex administrative apparatus involved in regulating interstate commerce, managing natural resources, and providing services to citizens throughout the country. This transformation required not just more buildings and workers, but new approaches to organizing and coordinating government operations. The outbreak of World War I in Europe initially seemed like a distant concern to most Americans, but it would ultimately accelerate Washington's development as a center of international power and influence. Even before American entry into the conflict, the capital became a focal point for diplomatic activity, as European nations sought to influence American policy and secure access to American resources and markets. The German embassy's espionage and sabotage activities, conducted from their impressive building on Massachusetts Avenue, highlighted Washington's new role as a center of international intrigue. The capital's diplomatic community expanded rapidly as nations recognized the growing importance of maintaining good relations with the United States. Embassy Row along Massachusetts Avenue began taking shape as countries competed to establish impressive diplomatic facilities. When America finally entered the war in April 1917, Washington once again transformed into a military command center, but on a scale that dwarfed even the Civil War mobilization. The War Department coordinated the deployment of 2 million American soldiers to Europe, while managing the complex logistics of supplying Allied forces across the Atlantic. The Navy Department expanded its operations to include convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare, fundamentally altering the scope and complexity of naval administration. The war effort required massive expansions of the federal bureaucracy that would permanently alter Washington's character and importance. New agencies were created to manage wartime production, coordinate transportation networks, and disseminate propaganda to maintain public support for the conflict. The Committee on Public Information, led by journalist George Creel, established Washington as a center for mass communication and public relations techniques that would influence government operations for decades to come. The capital's population swelled to accommodate this bureaucratic expansion, creating housing shortages and infrastructure strains, reminiscent of the Civil War-era temporary government buildings sprouted throughout the city, including massive structures on the National Mall that would remain in use long after the war's end. These temporary buildings, constructed of wood and concrete, housed thousands of government workers while permanently altering the appearance of the ceremonial spaces that the Macmillan Commission had envisioned. Women entered the federal workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war, taking on responsibilities that had previously been reserved for men. The typewriter pools and clerical departments of various agencies became predominantly female environments, establishing patterns of gender segregation in government employment that would persist for generations. These women, many of them college-educated and from middle-class backgrounds, brought new perspectives and capabilities to federal operations. The war also accelerated the migration of African Americans to Washington as they sought employment opportunities in the expanding federal government and defense industries. The capital's black population grew significantly during this period, creating new communities while intensifying existing tensions over housing, employment, and civil rights. The promise of federal employment offered hope for economic advancement, but discriminatory practices limited most African Americans to lower-level positions regardless of their qualifications. President Woodrow Wilson's decision to segregate federal offices reversed decades of slow progress toward racial integration in government employment. This policy change reflected broader national trends toward institutionalized segregation, but it was particularly painful in the capital city, where African Americans had achieved significant political and economic gains during Reconstruction. The segregation of federal facilities sent a clear message about the government's official position on racial equality. The armistice ending World War I in November 1918 brought massive celebrations to Washington streets as residents and government workers poured out of offices and homes to mark the conflict's conclusion. The celebrations reflected not just relief at the war's end, but pride in America's decisive contribution to the Allied victory. The United States had emerged from the conflict as the world's dominant economic and military power, fundamentally altering Washington's role in global affairs. The post-war period brought new challenges as the federal government struggled to demobilize millions of soldiers while managing the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy. Veterans Affairs became a major government responsibility, requiring new bureaucratic structures and significant financial resources. The Veterans Bureau, established in 1921, coordinated medical care, disability payments, and educational benefits for former servicemen, creating one of the largest and most complex government programs in American history. The war had also established important precedents for federal involvement in economic management and social welfare that would influence government operations for decades to come. Agencies created during the emergency continued operating in various forms, while the techniques developed for managing large-scale government programs became part of the permanent administrative toolkit, Washington had demonstrated its capacity to coordinate complex national efforts, establishing expectations for future government activism. The 1920s brought a period of relative normalcy to Washington as the Republican administrations of Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover pursued policies of limited government and business-friendly regulation. The federal bureaucracy contracted somewhat from its wartime peak, but remained much larger and more complex than it had been before 1917. The capital settled into new routines that reflected its enhanced importance, while maintaining the social and cultural patterns established during the previous decade. The completion of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922 provided Washington with one of its most iconic and emotionally powerful monuments. The massive structure, with its 36 columns representing the states of the Union at the time of Lincoln's death, created a western terminus for the National Mall that balanced the capital's dominance at the eastern end. Henry Bacon's design evoked ancient Greek temples while housing Daniel Chester French's monumental sculpture of the seated president. The memorial's dedication ceremony drew enormous crowds and established important precedents for how the nation would commemorate its historical figures and defining moments. The building's symbolic power would only grow over time, becoming a focal point for civil rights demonstrations and other expressions of American democratic ideals. The memorial transformed the National Mall into a true ceremonial space worthy of the world's most powerful democracy. The Washington Conference of 1921 to 1922 demonstrated the capital's new role as a center for international diplomacy and arms control negotiations. The gathering of major naval powers to discuss limitations on warship construction established Washington as a neutral venue for complex international negotiations. The conference's success in achieving significant arms reductions enhanced the capital's reputation as a place where difficult diplomatic problems could be resolved through patient negotiation. The conference also showcased Washington's growing capacity to host major international events. The capital's hotels, transportation networks, and ceremonial spaces proved adequate to accommodate delegates from around the world, while providing appropriate settings for both formal negotiations and social events. This experience would prove valuable as Washington prepared to take on even greater international responsibilities in the decades ahead. Throughout the 1920s, the implementation of the Macmillan Plan continued with the construction of major federal buildings that would define Washington's architectural character for generations. The Federal Triangle Project, begun in the late 1920s, would create a massive complex of government offices between Pennsylvania Avenue and the National Mall. The project's neoclassical buildings, constructed of limestone and granite, established architectural standards that emphasized permanence, dignity, and democratic values. The Triangle's buildings housed expanding federal departments while creating impressive streetscapes that reinforced Washington's role as the seat of a great nation. The Department of Commerce building, completed in 1932, was one of the largest office buildings in the world, at the time reflecting the federal government's growing involvement in economic regulation and development. The complex demonstrated that Republican government could create architecture equal to any monarchy while serving the practical needs of modern administration. The stock market crash of October 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression would soon test Washington's institutions and infrastructure in ways that no one could have predicted. The capital that had emerged from World War I as the center of the world's most powerful democracy was about to face its greatest peacetime challenge, one that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between the federal government and American society. The economic collapse would transform Washington from a relatively modest administrative center into the command post for unprecedented government intervention in the national economy. The New Deal programs that would emerge from this crisis would permanently alter both the size and scope of federal operations, requiring massive expansions of the bureaucracy and fundamental changes in how government related to ordinary citizens. As the 1920s drew to a close, Washington stood poised for another dramatic transformation. The capital had successfully evolved from a small government town into a major center of national and international power. The institutions, infrastructure, and architectural framework were in place to support even greater responsibilities. The question was whether the American political system could adapt quickly enough to meet the unprecedented challenges that lay ahead. The stage was set for Washington's emergence as not just the capital of America, but as the de facto capital of the democratic world. The decisions made in the city's marble halls and government offices would soon affect the lives of people on every continent, establishing Washington as one of history's most influential centers of political power. The Great Depression struck Washington with a force that would reshape not just the capital, but the entire relationship between American citizens and their government. As banks failed across the nation and unemployment soared to unprecedented levels, desperate Americans turned their eyes toward the marble buildings along the Potomac, demanding action from a federal government that had never before been asked to shoulder such enormous responsibilities. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's arrival in Washington in March 1933 marked the beginning of the most dramatic expansion of federal power in American history. The new president brought with him an army of advisors, economists, and social reformers who would transform the sleepy government town into a bustling command center for economic recovery. The famous 100 days that followed Roosevelt's inauguration saw the creation of dozens of new federal agencies, each requiring office space, personnel, and coordination with existing departments: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the National Recovery Administration, and countless other alphabet soup agencies sprang into existence almost overnight. Each required headquarters in Washington, straining the capital's office space to the breaking point. Temporary buildings once again sprouted throughout the city, including massive structures that housed thousands of workers processing relief applications, coordinating public works projects, and implementing new regulatory schemes. The transformation was visible everywhere. Government workers poured into the capital from across the country, bringing diverse backgrounds and perspectives to a city that had previously been dominated by a relatively small professional class. Young lawyers, economists, and social workers arrived with briefcases full of ambitious plans to remake American society. The energy was electric, with a sense that history was being made in real time, as the federal government assumed responsibilities that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The Supreme Court building, completed in 1935, provided a powerful symbol of the constitutional tensions that accompanied this expansion of federal power. The magnificent marble structure, with its iconic steps and classical columns, housed the 9 justices who would ultimately determine whether Roosevelt's New Deal programs conformed to constitutional limitations on government authority. The building's completion coincided with the court's most important period in American history, as the justices grappled with fundamental questions about the scope and limits of federal power. The famous court-packing controversy of 1937 brought these tensions to a head, as Roosevelt proposed expanding the Supreme Court to overcome conservative justices who had struck down key New Deal programs. The battle played out in Washington's halls of power with an intensity that rivaled any military campaign, as senators, congressmen, and interest groups maneuvered to influence the outcome. The controversy ultimately failed, but not before demonstrating the Capitol's role as the arena where America's most fundamental political questions would be resolved. The expansion of the federal workforce during the New Deal era permanently altered Washington's demographic composition. Women found increasing opportunities in government employment, though often in segregated departments and at lower pay scales than their male colleagues. The capital's African American community also grew significantly, as New Deal agencies offered some of the best employment opportunities available to educated blacks during an era of widespread discrimination. However, this growth occurred within a framework of rigid segregation that limited where African Americans could live, work, and socialize within the capital. The federal government itself maintained segregated facilities, while private businesses throughout Washington refused to serve black customers. The contradiction between democratic ideals and discriminatory practices created tensions that would eventually explode into demands for fundamental change. The late 1930s brought new challenges, as events in Europe and Asia suggested that another world war might be inevitable. Washington began preparing for the possibility of American involvement in overseas conflicts, establishing new military planning offices and expanding intelligence operations. The capital's diplomatic community grew more active as European nations sought American support against fascist aggression, while isolationist groups lobbied intensively to keep America out of foreign entanglements. The construction of the Pentagon, begun in 1941, represented both a practical response to military expansion and a powerful symbol of American determination to play a major role in world affairs. The massive five-sided structure, located across the Potomac River in Virginia, would become the largest office building in the world and the nerve center for global military operations. Its construction required innovative engineering and construction techniques, demonstrating American industrial capabilities while preparing for the massive military expansion that war would require. Pearl Harbor's attack on December 7, 1941, transformed Washington overnight from a peacetime capital into the command center for a global war effort that would dwarf even the mobilization of World War I. Within hours of the attack, the capital buzzed with activity as government departments worked around the clock to coordinate military responses, mobilize industrial production, and rally public support for the war efforts. The wartime expansion of Washington's population and infrastructure was staggering. Government employment swelled to over 280,000 workers by 1945, while defense contractors and military personnel added hundreds of thousands more residents to the metropolitan area. Housing shortages became acute as apartment buildings and boarding houses filled beyond capacity, while new residential developments sprawled into the Virginia and Maryland countryside. The capital's role in coordinating the Allied war effort established Washington as the de facto headquarters of the democratic world. Winston Churchill's frequent visits to the White House, along with meetings with other Allied leaders, demonstrated the capital's central importance in global strategy and diplomacy. The combined chiefs of staff operated from Washington, coordinating military operations across multiple theaters while managing the complex logistics of supplying forces on 6 continents. The Manhattan Project, though headquartered elsewhere, was coordinated from Washington offices that maintained strict secrecy while overseeing the development of atomic weapons. The project represented the ultimate expression of federal power and scientific capability, demonstrating that the American government could marshal resources and expertise on a scale that no other nation could match. The successful development of nuclear weapons would fundamentally alter Washington's role in international affairs for generations to come. Women's participation in the federal workforce reached unprecedented levels during the war, as traditional barriers fell in the face of urgent personnel needs. Government departments that had previously employed few women suddenly found themselves dependent on female workers to maintain essential operations. The experience challenged traditional assumptions about women's capabilities, while establishing precedents for greater participation in professional careers. The war also brought significant changes to Washington's African American community, as federal employment opportunities expanded and civil rights organizations established national headquarters in the capital. The March on Washington movement, led by A. Philip Randolph, demonstrated the growing political sophistication and organization of Black Americans, while highlighting the contradictions between fighting fascism abroad and maintaining segregation at home. Victory in 1945 brought celebrations to Washington's streets that rivaled those of 1918, but also uncertainty about America's future role in a world transformed by 6 years of devastating warfare. The United States had emerged as one of only 2 global superpowers, facing the Soviet Union across a divided Europe and an uncertain Asia. Washington would need to adapt once again to meet the challenges of leading the free world during an era of nuclear weapons and ideological competition. The creation of the United Nations, with American leadership and substantial Washington involvement, established the capital as a center for international organization and cooperation. While the UN headquarters would be located in New York, much of the planning and coordination occurred in Washington, reflecting the capital's central role in shaping the post-war international order. The establishment of NATO in 1949 further cemented Washington's position as the military and political leader of the Western Alliance. The treaty negotiations, conducted largely in the capital, created unprecedented peacetime commitments that would require permanent military establishments and diplomatic relationships spanning the globe. The Pentagon became not just the headquarters of American military forces, but the command center for a global network of allies and bases. The Cold War's onset brought new challenges that would test Washington's institutions in ways that even 2 world wars had not. The capital became the focal point for a global struggle between democratic and communist ideologies, with every decision carrying implications for nations and peoples throughout the world. The city's residents found themselves living at the epicenter of a conflict that could potentially end human civilization through nuclear warfare. The construction of massive government complexes throughout the Washington metropolitan area reflected the permanent expansion of federal responsibilities and capabilities. The Central Intelligence Agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, symbolized America's commitment to global intelligence gathering and covert operations. The National Security Agency's facilities at Fort Meade, Maryland, demonstrated the government's determination to monitor and analyze communications worldwide. These developments transformed Washington from a national capital into something unprecedented in human history. The command center of a global empire dedicated to democratic principles and free market economics. The decisions made in the capital's conference rooms and government offices would affect the daily lives of people from Berlin to Bangkok, from Seoul to Santiago. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s would soon challenge Washington to live up to the democratic ideals it promoted around the world. The contradiction between fighting for freedom abroad while denying basic rights to African Americans at home became increasingly difficult to ignore or justify. The capital that had emerged as the leader of the free world would need to confront its own legacy of racial discrimination and exclusion. The stage was set for Washington's final transformation into a truly global capital, a city whose influence would extend to every corner of the earth while remaining accountable to the democratic principles that had brought it into existence. The provincial government town that had struggled to attract residents was about to become the most powerful and influential city in human history. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963 brought 250,000 Americans to the Lincoln Memorial, transforming the capital into a stage for the most powerful demonstration of moral authority in the nation's history. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered from the steps of the memorial, that honored the great emancipator, created an indelible moment that would define Washington's role as the conscience of American democracy. The sight of peaceful demonstrators filling the National Mall from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial demonstrated the Capitol's unique power to serve as a forum for national conscience and moral reckoning. The civil rights legislation that followed these demonstrations marked another fundamental shift in Washington's role, as the federal government assumed unprecedented responsibility for enforcing equal rights throughout the nation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required massive expansions of federal enforcement capabilities, creating new departments and agencies to monitor compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Washington became the headquarters for a social revolution that would reshape American society from the ground up. The Vietnam War era brought profound challenges to Washington's moral authority and political legitimacy. As American involvement in Southeast Asia escalated throughout the 1960s, the Capitol became the focal point for increasingly bitter debates about the limits of American power and the proper use of military force. The Pentagon became both the symbol of American military might and the target of massive protests that questioned the wisdom and morality of the war effort. The anti-war demonstrations that surrounded the Pentagon in October 1967 created unprecedented scenes of confrontation between protesters and federal authorities. The sight of young Americans facing off against military police at the headquarters of the world's most powerful military establishment captured the deep divisions that were tearing the country apart. Washington found itself transformed from a symbol of national unity into a battlefield where fundamental questions about American values and priorities were fought out in the streets. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 triggered riots throughout Washington that left entire neighborhoods in ruins and required federal troops to restore order. The burning of buildings within sight of the Capitol Dome provided stark evidence of the racial tensions that continued to plague the Capitol, despite its role as the headquarters of the civil rights movement. The contrast between the city's marble monuments and its burning streets highlighted the gap between American ideals and American realities. The Watergate scandal of the early 1970s brought a different kind of crisis to Washington, as the Capitol became the setting for investigations that would ultimately bring down a sitting president. The break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, located in the Watergate complex along the Potomac River, triggered a series of revelations that exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. The subsequent congressional hearings, broadcast live from the Capitol, riveted the nation and demonstrated the continuing vitality of American democratic institutions. Washington has undergone countless transformations over more than 2 centuries, rising from swampy farmland through civil war, depression, and global conflict to become the epicenter of world power. The city that began as a political compromise between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison has evolved into something none of them could have imagined: a capital whose decisions shape the lives of billions. Whatever challenges lie ahead, Washington's remarkable journey from muddy construction site to global command center proves that even the most ambitious dreams can become reality through persistence, vision, and the enduring strength of democratic ideals.